From films to television, plays to musicals, and hundreds of books, Anne Boleyn has been portrayed in many different ways. Her story and the mythology around her has been a constant source of inspiration for the big and small screen. But how much of an impact has it had on the way that we perceive Anne? Well, to discuss this, I'm pleased to welcome Susan Bordo onto the podcast for a discussion based around her book, The Creation of Anne Boleyn, in search of the Tudors' most notorious queen. In the episode, Susan and I will discuss the different portrayals of Anne, what parts of Anne's story she would find amusing or baffling, and also, which I'm sure many people will be very excited to hear, what happened when Susan was able to spend 3 whole hours talking face to face with none other than Natalie Dormer herself. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 108, The Creation of Anne Boleyn with Susan Bordo. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Susan Bordo. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks. How are you, Adam?
Very well, thank you. So you're here today to talk about the book that you wrote over a decade ago now, I think. It's quite some time ago.
Yes, it's quite a while ago, 2013.
2013.
It first came out. And then the British edition was a little bit later than that, with this famous cover. Do you remember this cover?
I remember the cover well, yeah, because it was so unusual, but I loved it with the sunglasses. I thought it was so good. It was one of the first books that I read about Anne Boleyn that wasn't straightforward sort of biography, but one that explored the mythology and the creation, which is why you're here to talk about it today. Before we get into that conversation, though, just a few questions to get to know you a bit better for people listening in. So I wondered if you could provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up and what it is that you now do full time.
I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I'm a Northeastern girl. And I've lived in many different places because I was an academic. I'm retired now. And, academics move around quite a bit. Started out in New Jersey, went to school in Chicago, dropped out of school in Chicago, had a few years of just kind of hanging around, doing odd jobs of various sorts, working in bookstores. Then wound up in Canada, finished my degree in Canada. Well, you don't want the whole travelogue. Basically, at the very end of it all, I got a wonderful job at the University of Kentucky. And what was so terrific about that job was that it was an interdisciplinary chair. So I could do philosophy, I could do literature, I could do pop culture, I could do pretty much anything that I wanted to do, which was wonderful. And that was 1994. So that was the job that I held until I retired about 5 years ago. And at this point, I have been a writer of books. That's the direction that my career took me. Although if I go really far back to when I was first aspiring to be a writer, what I wanted to be was a movie reviewer. And that has stayed with me, so that when I began to write books, even though they were initially historically inclined and informed by the fact that my degree was in philosophy, I always dipped into pop culture. There were always references to movies and references to advertisements and television shows. And ultimately, after I retired, having written several different books, one of which is The Creation of Anne Boleyn, I started a Substack, and now I get to write whatever I want every week on my Substack. And I do politics, I do pop culture, I do some memoir, whatever seems to me to be pressing on my brain and heart at the time,
Mm.
which lately has become more and more politics. We don't have to talk about politics, but it is, as you can imagine, especially in the States, it's an all-absorbing and all-troubling
Yeah.
subject.
Yes,
Having
I can.
said that, we can let it go.
So, given the conversation that we're having today about Anne Boleyn, your book, The Creation of Anne Boleyn, if you had the ability to go back and witness a moment from Anne Boleyn's life, you could jump in a time travel machine, what would it be?
I would love to go travel to virtually any moment in her life. I thought about this for a while because it seems to me the what I am most curious about is who she was. Unlike
Yeah.
more recent figures of note, and because Henry destroyed so much evidence of her existence, and she's been so mythologized and then reinterpreted and reinterpreted. There's we have no sense of what Anne was really like. And that's what I would love to do. I would love to be in some context of her life where I'd be able
Mm.
to get to know who she really was and what she thought about, how she felt. Could be, in the French court, could be when she was a child in Hever Castle, could be in at the Tower of London. And then once we got started talking, I would ask her particular things. Did you really write that letter in the tower? That
Mhm.
kind of thing. There's just so
Yeah.
much that is a concoction of the twists and turns of popular imagination that she just begs to be fantasized as a person. So I'd love to meet her as a
Mhm.
person anywhere, any place, anytime.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean because there's things about people from history that we also, no matter how much we try, we'll never know. We will never know how she sounded. We'll never know how she. This sounds silly, but how she walked. How did she carry herself? How did she actually?
Exactly.
What was her physicality like? Those things
Yes, we will never know her hair
will
color.
never.
I mean, we
Yeah,
don't even have to get to the way she walked and the way she sounded. We don't know what she looked like.
yeah.
We don't know. There's a huge dispute about her hair color. She's always described as having very dark hair. But in a lot of portraits, she's a dark redhead. I suppose you would call it
Mm,
chestnut or
Auburn or
how do you make sense of that? Is the
yeah.
dark hair a way of associating her with being a witch? Because after all, an awful lot of the descriptions of her are sort of contaminated
Mm,
by the ideas about her that her enemies had. So
yeah.
there's so little we know. I personally, being a redhead myself, have always fancied that she was some species of redhead, probably dark red hair, because she was described by many people as being, not the typical English fair-skinned,
Mm,
fair-haired beauty of the time. And I think there's enough descriptions like that we can speculate that, she didn't look like Mary Pickford, or I'm not quite sure who the comparable English actress would be. Um, but beyond that, we really don't know very much.
mm. And you might have answered it already, but if you had the opportunity to ask Anne Boleyn a single question, what would it be?
Oh, that is a good one.
When were you born is what I would go to.
Uh, I think what I would do, and this is in a way getting to a more general plane again, is ask her if you didn't have to worry about your political enemies, if you didn't have to worry about being put in prison or your head chopped off, or how what you said about Henry and your life would be used against you, how would you describe it to me? What would you say? How did you feel about Henry? So many of the
Mhm.
novels have you either manipulating him and not really caring about him, or falling head over heels in love. What's the truth of it all? We have his letters, but we don't have your letters to him. They've been lost. So we don't even
Hmm.
have the documentation that we might interpret. His letters, his love letters require interpretation, but at least we have the words in front of us. We don't have your words in front of you. I think I'd also like to know whether she did, I think I mentioned this already, whether she did write that letter to Henry while she was in the tower, because there is so much
Hmm.
speculation about that. And
Yeah.
it's interesting speculation
Yeah.
because a lot of it, it seems to me, depends upon whether or not you credit her with a certain amount of intelligence and articulateness in expressing herself, or you don't.
Hmm.
So that a lot of the skeptics among the early historians, for example, just dismiss the idea that she could have written the letter because, of course, she couldn't have written like that. It's beautiful prose. It's a beautiful, vibrant and articulate
Mm.
letter. People nowadays have been re-examining it. I haven't kept up with that debate. Maybe you know more than I do about what kind of common verdict is at this point. Did she write it? Did she not?
Well, a friend of mine is a wonderful historian, lovely lady called Sandy Fasoli, who is a historian, researcher, and she's been doing huge amounts of work around the letter. She even managed to get into the Vatican archives to examine Henry's letters to Anne, and she is absolutely convinced that it is legitimate and that Anne Boleyn did write it. As I
Fantastic.
yeah, she's been doing a lot of, I mean, I'm talking years of research around this letter, and she's now bringing in all different tools and everything as well, and she's fully convinced it is authentic.
I've always felt it was. And in the book, I
Mm.
argue for the authenticity of it. I do know Sandy. We have not corresponded in a long, long time. But when we were both sort of, when Boleyn was beginning to be an object of great interest among a lot of us,
Mm.
and we all had our various pages on Facebook and in the internet, I knew her then. She probably remembers me too. And I remember talking to her about the letters, and I saw that she does have a book about it. So now I know what she
Mm.
argues in the book. I think she's absolutely right, even without having read the book.
Yeah.
It is not at all unlike, at least the way, leaving aside the various kinds of, evidence, the material evidence.
Hmm.
To me, it's very much what I would expect from her as a personality.
I would agree. As we've discussed, you're here to talk about the book that you wrote, The Creation of Anne Boleyn, in search of the Tudors' most notorious queen. Now, on the genesis of the book, what initially inspired you to write The Creation of Anne Boleyn, and how did your background in feminist theory, in particular, shape the way that you approached Anne's story?
Yeah, I actually became interested in Anne. It was a discovery. It was not something, the most that I knew was what I had learned in history in high school, which, as you can imagine, in the United States is not a hell of a lot. We pay not enough attention to our own history, let alone British history. But I had a journalist from the UK contact me wanting to write a book about women who talked back, women who were irrepressible, women who didn't necessarily conform to the norms of their day. And he had a whole list of women. And the idea was we were
Hmm.
going to collaborate on them and write little essays about each one. And because my work had the book that I had written that was most well known was about women and their problems with body image and eating. He had the idea of calling it the Anne Boleyn diet. And in each little blurb, each little essay, somehow also getting around to the food issue. So I decided, well, because he had put it in the title, I would start looking into Anne Boleyn and see if there was anything that I thought might lend itself to an essay in a book. And I became seduced. I was fascinated. And I think that in particular, I was fascinated and I gobbled up everything. I just spent, a couple of years just reading everything I could get my hands on. And I think what particularly fascinated me and why, as a feminist, I was drawn to feel that maybe I had something to contribute was the degree to which the views of her political enemies had shaped so much of the dominant writing about her. So that I began to see the way in which a certain kind of femme fatale archetype had really grabbed a hold of the popular imagination. And when I researched where did this come from, there was Chapuis, and there was Sander, and there were, people who had every reason to paint her in the most negative light. And yet, the earliest historians and the earliest writers of fiction just took it. Even very reputable historians just took what Chapuis said and wrote about it as though it were fact. So I had the idea that there was the kind of thing going on here that, as someone who had done my degree in philosophy, I was very familiar with, which is the way that notions about women had suffused philosophy, religion, literature, history, and but really surprised at how historical these non-historical views of her claim to be. So I sort of kind of imagined it as detective work, feminist detective work. I'm going to see, as much as I can, both where these views came from and then how they became embedded in popular representations of Anne. What I discovered when I got deeper into it was that they weren't the only views of Anne. Anne, the scheming temptress, was not, in fact, the only views of Anne, though it is what I call the default Anne. That is, we're constantly reverting to it. But throughout the centuries, she's been a shapeshifter. Because we really knew so little about her, she's lent herself very well to becoming a female representative of ideas from within the period in which the writer lived in, rather than the period that Anne lived in. And that is something I've always found fascinating. It's a place where my interest as a philosopher, as a feminist, as a literary critic, they all come together, is in the examination of how the texts, whether they be portraits or whether they be descriptions in letters, the degree to which they reflect the cultures from which they come. I've always been fascinated with that. And at the point at which we got to the 20th century, there were movies to look at too. And, my first love, movies, began to be something that I could also incorporate. So it was a topic that just lent itself to so many kinds of explorations that interested me. And I could write about it as the kind of writer that I am without claiming for any kind of absolute truth. We really don't know. But I could look through her different shapes, her different versions over the centuries and help people to get an idea of where they came from and maybe become a little skeptical about what they absorbed and took as fact from the standard histories. I think that is something, if I can just sort of veer off a tiny bit, that's really crucial nowadays is that we help teachers, for example, help students learn to sift out fact from fiction. So much of the world has been fictionalized, and people have lost skill at untangling fact and fiction. That is something that I
Mm.
guess consider to be the underlying theme of my life's work, even going way beyond the Anne Boleyn book itself.
So, were there any discoveries or insights about Anne Boleyn that truly surprised you during your research?
Well, I mean, virtually everything that wasn't just standard history textbook surprised me. But I think
Right.
what surprised me the most, besides what I've mentioned already, which was the degree to which very dominant portraits of her relied on her enemies. I mean, that was kind of shocking, actually. But I
Mm.
also didn't know about her advocacy of reform. I didn't know about her life at courts, at which extremely uh, intelligent and you could say proto-feminist women presided. I knew about Margarita Navarre from studying history of feminist thought because she's seen as somebody who, in her own way, did contribute to ideas about gender. Had no idea that Anne was at that. I mean, I knew she was at that court, but I never was able to put them together. So that was fascinating to me, just fascinating to me. That was total news to me. Um, I'm trying to think if there was anything else that was really the shockers that learning, well, and of course, learning that bit about her and the European courts
Mm.
also provided that extra perspective on her that gave the lie to a lot of the stereotypical portraits. I think that people nowadays who are first becoming aware of Anne through books that have been written recently, they of course learn about her interest in Protestantism, what we now call Protestantism, her
Yeah.
advocacy of it. When the first histories were written right into the mid 20th century, it wasn't mentioned at all.
Yeah.
You know, it just simply was not a part of the standard picture. And yet it was so fundamental to her, as I understand it from what I've written,
Hmm.
that it's kind of shocking to encounter the degree to which it was submerged. I think, in a way, you know, to get back to your question and just sort of sum it up, I think the things that surprised me the most were the things that were submerged. And what was left was
Okay.
this kind of like cartoon, you know, that who varied from period to period, but what really was a cartoon. And she only
Yeah.
starts to become a really fleshed out person in the middle of the 20th century. So that was, I think, one of the most surprising things about her was how little of her was in the most popular representations. And then, of course, you know, once you get into those representations, the distortions are shocking. The
Mm.
distortions are horrifying. I mean, Philippa Gregory, please, please, somebody tell her to stop writing about these women. I have had students, you know, once I had written the book, I taught a couple of courses, graduate course, undergraduate course, and I cannot tell you the number of students who came in and just swore to me that Anne had slept with her brother, that her
Mm.
sister had carried away her daughter, that, you know, what else is in that book? That Henry raped her.
Yeah.
And
I know.
I had to really basically deprogram them from Philippa
Yeah.
Gregory. Amazing. She
It's
just
funny, isn't
embedded
it?
herself in their brains.
Yeah, it's such a funny one. I had a sort of slightly similar experience in that when I hired my accountant, we were talking and everything, and he said, "Oh, I saw a really good Tudor film, The Other Boleyn Girl," and I just gave him this withering look, and he said, "Oh God, have I got off to a very bad start?" And I said, "Yes, you have."
Right.
But on that subject is actually incredibly apt, because my next question is, how do you think modern portrayals of Anne Boleyn, especially in film and television, like dramas like The Tudors or Wolf Hall, have shaped public perception of her character and her legacy, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one of the reasons why it's very interesting to me. And I would like to do a kind of update in my research because at a certain point I stopped and I turned to other things. Is I think that there's, so I'm not completely, I mean, I'm prefacing this by saying I am not completely up to date
Yeah.
on the representations of Anne that are floating around there now. But my sense is that among, let's call it her female fans, right? Though I'm it's certainly true that there are many male fans of hers too, that she's become an object more of admiration. That
Hmm.
Genevieve Bujold, to a certain extent, and certainly Natalie Dormer, who is not my favorite. As we discovered last time we talked, we both love Genevieve Bujold. I mean, she is just, that's it. That's the quintessential Anne for me. But I think
Totally.
that for the girls that I talked with as I was writing the book, Natalie Dormer was the most important Anne in that
Yeah, the gateway
she,
drug.
sorry?
The gateway drug, effectively.
Exactly, a gateway drug, and someone they identified with. In other words, insofar as she was, and this is largely due to Natalie Dormer's hand in it, because the first season, Michael Hurst really followed the old pattern of the temptress.
Yeah.
Natalie Dormer was having none of that, and she said, no, I want more of her intellectuality. I want more of her religious commitments. People have to see that. And he did listen to her. I mean, to give him credit, he did listen to her. So you see in the following season, much more of a kind of a woman who is sexual, flirtatious, uh, and yet at the same time has strong intellectual interests, speaks her mind, is independent in a lot of ways. And I think that, now this may be a total fantasy, but as a fantasy that captured contemporary women's imaginations more
Mm.
than any other Anne. And I think that has stuck with one exception. I think it's stuck in that the representations that I'm vaguely familiar with since I stopped, since the book came out, have been very sympathetic to her.
Yeah.
For the most part, you just don't see that Anne that everybody loved to hate. Philippa Gregory was really the dying gasp of that, I think.
Mm.
Except Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel. Now, she's not a one dimensional character, right? She's not stereotypical. She has personality. But if you read that book carefully and bring up the bodies, you see that she has made certain choices. She's left out a lot of things that would have made Anne seem more sympathetic.
Hmm.
And she's added details that made her seem feral, greedy, politically conniving. Now, she might have been all of that. But in reading the book, I was very much aware of the gaps in it. There's no letter from the Tower. There's not even her speech at her trial, as
Yeah.
I recall. I mean, it's like the parts of Anne that cut against the stereotype of the femme fatale have been cut out.
Mm.
Her prerogative as a writer, but To me, it's a throwback.
Yeah.
It's like a regression to an old view of Anne. And I think, speculative on my part, I think in some ways she was answering back to the feminists who had turned her into something of a heroine, and she was not going to go for that.
Yeah.
I don't know whether she saw it as ideological or what, because we corresponded, we never did get into that. We always talked on the level of the text rather than motivation. But it did seem to me that she did not do justice to Anne in the way that she did justice, for example, to her main character, Cromwell.
Yeah.
He emerges as a very fleshed out character. Anne is still kind of stereotypical.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think the one of the things, I actually loved Claire Foy's interpretation of Anne Boleyn. But she's a very brittle Anne, and I can fully appreciate
Brittle.
that. But what I think one of the features of Claire Foy's interpretation of Anne that I thought was superb, and I've not seen it. I don't believe I've seen it in any other version of Anne, is what I think would have been true of Anne, which is that almost sense of imposter syndrome, of that acute anxiety about her position. I think Claire Foy plays her as a woman desperately trying to cling on to an increasingly oily pole. And I feel like that probably was what the real Anne Boleyn felt like a lot of the time.
I think that that's exactly right. I was really talking about the books. I
Yeah.
think Claire Foy added to the interpretation of Anne in
Mm,
ways that were exactly as you described them, that
yeah.
kind of not just feral. Mantel describes her as having sharp teeth, sharp teeth like a little wolf, but full of
Yeah.
anxiety, living on the precipice, or as you put it, trying to hang on to a greasy pole. Did you say that
Yeah.
sounds now a
Yeah.
little double meaning? But anyway, and she really saw that. I also think that Claire Foy did the execution scene better than anyone.
Mm,
Better than anyone, because you saw, I mean, all of them have gone to their deaths with great composure.
yeah.
You did see Natalie Dormer tremble a little bit, right? But Genevieve was, just, stalwart. And with Claire Foy, you just saw the chill, the horrible feeling it must be to
Mm,
know that, that blade is going to come down on your neck. And I thought she was magnificent in that scene, and in general did a wonderful job as Anne.
yeah. I agree. So, in your book, you tackle many long-standing myths about Anne. Which myth did you find the hardest to dismantle, and why do you think it persisted for so long?
Well, it's trivial, but the six fingers. I
Yeah.
mean, you find it, that as I was looking at books of amazing facts, it's listed, always listed, Anne Boleyn had six fingers. And it's interesting because, of course, there is some suggestion by, oh my gosh, now the name escapes me, the nephew of the poet, Wyatt,
Hmm.
who wrote about her during the Elizabethan reign, that she did have a tiny extra vesticular, is that the right word?
Yeah, it's a second, like almost like a second small nail.
A second small nail. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think he says, which, she wore long sleeves over, and whose slight imperfection brought even more to attention her great beauty. I mean, that's the way he describes it. But then in, the Catholic polemicist's hands, it becomes a full extra finger and a sign of the devil.
Yeah.
So it's meaningful, even though you could say it's kind of trivial. but it's also hung on. It's hung on. I mean, it's in paintings, it's in sculpture. My students all believed it. Um, I think the more significant myth, and it's a kind of set of myths, I suppose, and I mostly blame Philippa Gregory for this, is that she oh gosh, I was thought of another one now too. But in any case, that she slept with her brother and gave
Yeah.
birth to a deformed child, which there really, as far as I know, there isn't any evidence of it other than some things that Chapuis said about some, mass. Um,
Shapeless mass of flesh.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And one that I thought of as I was talking is this idea, her relationship with Elizabeth. That has always fascinated me because the common coin myth is, oh no, a girl, get her out of my sight,
Mm.
right? And everything I read led me to believe that neither she nor Henry responded to Elizabeth's birth that way. But I think it has stuck. It has stuck that, and probably until Natalie Dormer. Well, Genevieve Bujold, but thinking about people today, who may not have seen Anne of the Thousand Days, more to their pain.
Yes.
I
I
mean,
always tell people it's the one to watch.
it is. It really is. And
Yeah.
my students were shocked at how much they loved it. And they cheered when she gave her speech, and they were shocked because almost all the movies that I had them watch, they just couldn't relate to at all. But they loved Anne of the Thousand Days. This is when I was teaching a movie course.
Yeah.
I would really like to have known uh, about her as a mother.
Hmm.
What what that was like for her to love a child, to love an infant, and I'm assuming she did, that had so little value in
Yeah.
the larger world. Um, I have a daughter, and I even experienced some of that in 2025. This feeling of a gap between this precious individual and what the world might think of her. Um, so that's something to get back to an earlier question of yours. That's one of the things I want to talk to her about.
Mm.
What was Elizabeth? Elizabeth fascinates me too. I mean, I just a lot of people suggested that I write a book about her afterwards, but I was on to other things.
So, in your opinion, how does viewing Anne Boleyn through a feminist lens alter our understanding of her as a historical figure compared to, I suppose, more traditional narratives?
It's difficult to answer that question because the feminist part of my thinking is so entwined with everything else that I bring to the way I understand the world. It's hard to pull out
Mm.
the part of my book that was informed specifically by my feminism. I think that it certainly predisposed me to believe whatever I could about her. So, for example, the letter, instead of being inclined to disbelieve, I was inclined to believe. Like a person who is testifying to having been sexually harassed. My first instinct is believe. You'll have to prove to me that she wasn't, that she isn't, rather than the other way around. So there was a certain readiness to be sympathetic to her, to pay attention to the way in which the gendered norms of her time affected how she was brought up, affected how people saw her, constrained her in certain ways. I think it made me more interested than most were at the time in the relationship with Henry. And as a real male female relationship, because I have always, there are many different versions of feminists, as you know, and I've always been, my first book was about a male philosopher, and I later wrote a book about men called The Male Body: A New Look at Men in Public and in Private. And I have always thought of my interest as being about gender rather than feminism. Per se, politically, I'm a feminist. But in terms of my intellectual orientation, it hasn't been to dig up women from history, for example, the way feminist historians have. Anne was a wonderful discovery for me, but I have friends who, in literature, who saw that their career was shaped by their feminism to unearth the forgotten women, right, who had written novels. I've never approached what I do that way. Partly because I was trained as a philosopher, and if you were going to be in search of women in philosophy, you would have pretty slim pickings until like the Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, and creatures here and there. Christine de. They're there, but certainly we weren't taught about them when I was in graduate school. So I learned to, if you'll pardon my using the expression, deconstruct what men thought, rather than necessarily to look at what women were saying. And that has always been a part of my feminism, has been looking at male-shaped representations and the way they've dominated history, which certainly I became aware of in studying philosophy. But also, it's hard to understand. I mean, I realize that nowadays there's an inclination to go beyond dualisms in terms of gender and sexuality. And, that's fine. But since I am interested in representations, right, rather than what people are actually doing in their lives or how they're born or, for me, it's impossible to understand the representation of women without understanding men. It's impossible to understand femininity without understanding masculinity, as we have constructed each of those. They work throughout most of the cultures that we come out of. They have worked as two sides of, they've been polarities mostly. And so it was inevitable that I write a book about men. I also have, as a feminist, always been drawn to the possibility of convincing men that feminism is their friend. That the stereotypes of feminists just, are largely stereotypes. And that what we had to offer men was something that understood the dilemmas they found themselves in, the constraints of their gender, the ways that they had felt shamed, because I think of shame as a really important human emotion or feeling, experience, the ways that masculinity had constrained them. And I had the reputation, as a teacher, if you want to take a feminist course, take Susan Bordo's course. You won't believe she's a feminist, right? Which is kind of but of course, I am. It's a part of my being that will has always been there and will always be there. Doesn't mean that the men in my class when I was a teacher are going to come in and be told that they're responsible for all of civilization's ills, because that isn't the way I read it. That just isn't the way I read it. Um,
Yeah.
Now, Henry is another matter. I mean,
Well, and on with regard to Anne Boleyn, if she could see the way that she's portrayed now, from pop culture to academic circles, what do you think she'd be the most amused or bewildered by?
well, she would undoubtedly be bewildered by six. I mean, which is just a romp, you know. It doesn't appeal to me very much. I know people love it, but I've never really enjoyed the idea of the six. The idea that when we were in England and I was doing research there, and we went to various kinds of historical places with my daughter, it was always six, like six little chocolates and six little teacups. And
Yeah.
I've never really that never appealed to me. And it seems to me that that idea has been resuscitated in something like six. Not my cup of tea. I know people love it. But I think Anne would look at it and it would be like, what is this? What is this? Is this some sort of strange puppet show or a court amusement? What is happening here? In terms of, what she would find most, like closer to her heart. Gee, I don't know. I would have to meet her and talk to her first.
I do think she'd get a real kick out of knowing that she is undoubtedly the most popular of the six.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the pieces that I wrote is called Revenge of the Consorts. And it's basically, about Anne and Diana.
Uh-huh.
It's about Anne and Diana. The idea of, okay, you did this to me in your life, but I am without a doubt the most famous, the most loved, the most fascinating to everyone else. That's why I called it The Revenge of the Consorts. I think you're right, that she would be tickled by that, and possibly not surprised.
Yeah, and you even actually see it. I mean, you mentioned you're not particularly fond of six. I love it. I think it's brilliant. But I think what's quite telling about Anne Boleyn in six is that even the other five are conscious that Anne, I mean, they literally her song opens with them saying the one you've been waiting for, the one you've been waiting for. And that's incredibly telling, isn't it? That even in six, which is all about the equality of the six women and not treating them as just these wives, that even in the context of that, they are still acknowledging that Anne is the one that most people in the room are there to see.
No, that's a really good point. And I have to say, I've only seen it on television. I haven't seen it in the theater, and I would
Right.
imagine that it carries other kinds of things with it than you get on television. Um, and I suppose I
Yeah.
just have I have a love of Anne that doesn't want to see her as one of six, even if she is the most special one. That sort of brings
Hmm.
up something else that I wanted to say before about the mythology. There's a whole lot of mythology around the woman that she displaced too. I mean, the idea that Catherine was this long-suffering washrag who, got the most out of sitting down in a hair shirt, praying every day. I mean, that seems to me to be betrayed by an awful lot that is in the historical record.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, perhaps somebody has done something on her that that challenges that mythology. and I haven't read it yet, but I hope it's there because that goes along with, that when you talk about, or I mentioned dualities, there is that male-female duality, but there's also the good woman, bad woman. And the
Oh,
whole
totally.
Catherine Anne thing has so fallen into that over the years, when they were both pretty
Yeah.
formidable women, both of them.
Yeah, and there's such a culture, isn't there, that if you love Anne Boleyn, you must hate Catherine and vice versa. And you go, well, no, they can, we can like them both, we can hate them both respectively. Anne Boleyn is my favourite figure from history, but I have nothing but respect for Catherine of Aragon's story. We just have this tendency far more. I think there is no question whatsoever that we pit women against each other far more than we do men, and in particular royal women, and we see that now. You only have to look at Kate versus
Ah,
Meghan, Fergie versus Diana, the Queen versus her sister Princess Margaret. It's just a fact that we pit women against each other for some ridiculous reason.
yeah, it's throughout history. It's done in virtually every novel and every movie, and it's just kind of
Mm.
extraordinary. And I mean, I think various psychologists have explanations, in from infancy, where there is the good mother and the bad mother, the breast that withholds its nurturing, and the breast that offers itself. I'm not saying that I buy that theory, but that certainly is one theory as to why we're constantly dividing women into angels and whores.
Mhm.
It's but it certainly sticks. It certainly sticks. And you're right. You see it in the I haven't really followed very much. I didn't follow at the time I followed Fergie and Diana. I had kind of forgotten about that at this point because the Kate and Meghan is so dominant.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in researching and writing the book?
I guess the two biggest challenges are on two ends of the spectrum. One was understanding the historical documents because I went back to all of them. And of course, they're just written in a style that is hard to disentangle. And especially for someone like myself, I hadn't had the education that prepared me for doing that. So that was a challenge. The other part was the fact that I lived in the United States and I don't fly. So the amount of on-site research that I could do was limited to two trips that I made on the Queen Mary too. When I was a professor, that kind of thing got paid for. No more, but so I was able to do that, and I, also gave some talks which helped to pay for it. Um, but I would have been much happier living in England and being able to just, when I came across a reference to something, been able to go there. The amount of time that I actually did spend there. And of course, it also gave me the opportunity to meet Natalie Dormer and interview her, and to meet Howard Brenton and interview him. He had a play going on at the time, and to go to Hever Castle. And I mean, all of that was really important to me, and I would have liked to have been able to do more of it. Um, but I think the rest was, just incredibly enjoyable. Incredibly enjoyable for me. Reading the novels, watching the movies,
Mm.
just following her career through time. That was a kind of methodology that wasn't at all foreign to me. I had already done that sort of thing, but just not with, this particular historical figure.
Yeah. And because you just mentioned there that you met Natalie Dormer as part of the research, and I'm sure there's going to be people listening and going, "Oh my God, tell me more." So, what was that? What was that like? What was she like?
She was wonderful. She was wonderful. Well, first of all, at the time, I benefited from the fact that she was not yet famous as
Mm.
she is now. I mean, people were what the Tudors really had just been on. And people were, her career was just starting to take off. So that combined with the generosity of her personality, she gave me like, 3 hours of her time and which just blew my mind, oh my God, she's going to, sit down and talk to me for as long as I want. And she and I just sort of clicked. We
Mm.
sort of clicked. We had a similar understanding of Anne. She was more strikingly feminist than I had ever imagined. I mean, I had never met her. It wasn't as though I had her pegged as an
Mm.
anti-feminist. It's just that she was so much, she was so appalled at how highly sexualized Anne had been in the first season. Oh, and she had wonderful stories to tell. And by now, these stories have filtered down. But I actually was the first person to ever tell them because I was the first person she told them to, which is that Michael Hurst had
Oh,
wanted
I
her to be a
know.
blonde,
Ridiculous.
which is just amazing. And she, though she was a virtually unknown actress at the time, who had been hired because of her chemistry with Jonathan, John,
Yeah. Jonathan
Jonathan.
Rhys-Meyers.
What's his name again? uh, that she just put it, she wouldn't do it. She said, no, I
Yeah.
can't do that. I can't do that. She may have been, we may not know the exact color of her hair, but she most definitely was not a blonde. And I just won't do it. And she even had gone as far as to she is a natural blonde. I mean, that's a piece that we have to put in here. She is a natural blonde. So before she had threshed this all out with Michael Hurst, she had dyed her hair
Mm.
black. And then when she came and met him, and he said, why is your hair black? You're supposed to be a blonde. And for a while, she said she kind of looked like a skunk, with like a part blonde and part very fashionable today, by the way, but, not then. And she got him to, I did speak to him too. I didn't meet him, but I did speak to him at length on the telephone. And I found him really a really, he was someone who really listened. He listened to her. He was interested in what I
Mm.
had to say. I mean, he was not at all stuck in any of his views, and I appreciated that very much. And I think he regretted the fact that in his desire to make a show that would be gobbled up by people, and that wouldn't be stiff, that would have flesh and vitality and
Mm.
sexuality in it. He did feel he went too far and
Mhm.
regretted that. And, openly said that he regretted it. And I appreciated that a lot about him. His receptiveness to understanding, and he did make changes. But Natalie was we just had a great time together. It was like being with a girlfriend, something that one critic, I think in the Daily Mail, which I gather you people don't really respect all that much anyway, he made fun of me, this critic, I don't even remember his name, for talking about being with Natalie Dormer. And we kind of, were chatting like old girlfriends. Like to him, that was just like, oh, what a stupid detail to put in there. But of course, people just loved that description. The Natalie Dormer fans loved that description of, could imagine, oh my gosh, she got to sit and just be a girlfriend with Natalie Dormer. They loved it. And then, I sent her a copy of the book and she wrote a beautiful blurb for the
Mm.
paperback. And, she was just terrific. All the people that I talked to were quite terrific.
Well, I also have to ask you about my favourite, your favourite, Geneviève Bujold as well.
Yes.
The actress who played Anne in Anne of a Thousand Days. Now, I know you didn't physically meet her, but you spoke online, I think, or on the phone, was
On the
it?
telephone,
It was on the
on the
telephone.
telephone. She, is out in Malibu and very reclusive. I'm not sure she would, even if I had been able to fly out there, that she would have wanted to, but she did talk on the telephone to me quite extensively.
Mm.
And she was immensely charming, and very smart. I mean, both these actresses that I got to talk to were, extremely both intuitive and very knowledgeable, intuitive and knowledgeable, and just plain smart about how to interpret Anne. And, Genevieve very much wanted Anne to be like, as fiery as she played her. And do you want me to tell the little anecdote about
Oh, I do. The anecdote is just brilliant.
we talked, and she talked about her upbringing and how she saw Anne. And at the very end, I asked her, I knew she had to go, and I said, are there any other Annes that you admire, interpretations of Anne that you admire? Have you seen Natalie Dormer? Have you seen Natalie who's he? The other Boleyn girl? Yeah.
Portman.
Um, and she said, no, I haven't seen any of those. And I said, well, can you imagine? Is there someone you imagine? And she said this in, a very determined voice, as determined as Anne telling Henry off in the tower. She said, no, Anne is mine. Wonderful. It was just wonderful. I just floated on a cloud for the rest of the day. And everybody has loved that story, imagining her saying that.
It's so her version of Anne Boleyn, that remarkable scene in the Tower of London, and we discussed this a few weeks ago. I am forgiving of that huge historical inaccuracy because it is just so spectacular. It gives Anne the moment that we all wish she could have had, which I think is
Exactly.
why, even though I'm quite critical of big historical inaccuracies in things, there are times when I can bend, and that was where I was very happy to bend because it's so brilliant. And I actually think it's the reason why Anne doesn't have an execution. She doesn't have the scaffold speech in Anne of a Thousand Days. I think because she got her moment already in that tower scene.
That's that's absolutely. I had never thought of it that way, but you're right. It would have been anticlimactic. She already had her speech, and she still was wonderful going to mounting the stairs. And oh gosh, just thinking about it makes me want to watch the movie again.
Yeah. Are you aware of, you
Um,
probably are, but are you aware of the issues that her and Richard Burton had?
which issue?
Well, they didn't get along a lot of the time.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's so ironic for, Richard Burton talking about the pet pot calling the kettle black. He nicknamed her Gin because apparently she turned up a couple of times smelling of gin.
Oh, he should be one to talk.
Exactly. That's
Oh
what I
my.
and there's that wonderful, again, you might be aware of this, but that wonderful story about Elizabeth Taylor telling Hal Wallis, "I have to play Anne," and Richard Burton perhaps sort of put his hand on her hand and say, "Sorry, love, you're too long in the
Too
tooth."
long in the tooth. Yes. Yeah, I tell that one in the book actually. Yeah. Yeah. That's and apparently she hung around the set
Mm,
quite a bit because she was nervous about what might transpire between Genevieve and Richard.
yeah, and I think Genevieve said, "I'm going to give that bitch an acting lesson she'll never forget," or something along those lines.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
So my final question for you then is, if you could rewrite an aspect of Anne's historical narrative that you feel has been particularly misrepresented, what would it be and why?
Yeah. Wow, that's such a good question, and it's not one that I have a ready answer for. I think what I would be drawn to, and this is just off the top of my head, if I might be lying in bed tonight and think of, oh no, this is really what I'd rather do. But off the top of my head, I would really like to, and Anne of a Thousand Days did definitely move in this direction to portray her relationship with Henry in a way that did justice to the attraction he had for the parts of her that we love now. The fierceness, the independence, and there are suggestions that Henry did feel something like that. You know, she is not made of ordinary clay. Well, you can interpret that any way you want, but there are places where you get the sense that he was drawn to something in her that he later came to fear and hate, but that, you know, so I would love to see something that did that in a more, I mean, in a thousand days does it, but for its time. It's sort of like to see it done more from the perspective of the way relationships can be complicated as we see them, and her side of it especially. I mean, I mentioned Henry's side first, but really, Anne, was she? I'd like to see a representation in which, without her being just, you know, setting her sights on Henry, that she is drawn to him. She's genuinely drawn to him. And we just don't see that. You know, that is not
Yeah.
a part of the way. It's hard for me to think of actually any of them just at the moment that have her falling in love with him or something like it. I mean, can you think of one that does that?
Yeah, I think Anne of a Thousand Days does that in so it does show the progression of her falling in love with him, but only when she gets that security.
And after they
Yeah.
have sex together, you know, that becomes the sort of, in a few novels too, that's a
Mm.
kind of turning point that she's, you know, either indifferent or fearful or something. And then after they have sex, she's transformed, which is kind of also like
Yeah, a bit of a trope.
an old thing, you know, that, um, but, you know, he's a
Yeah,
mystery in
yeah,
many
yeah.
ways. Henry is a mystery. And you want to see them, and Anne in a Thousand Days comes the closest to see them sort of actually having a wrangling with each other, you know, an attraction and a fear and an anger and two dominant, very large personalities, you know, trying to be together,
Yeah.
but finding it very difficult.
Yeah, it's the reason. I mean, it's Richard Burton was sort of quite apt in this respect, but I often just because there's a question that a lot of people will often ask is who was the love of Henry VIII's life, and there's this natural assumption to go Jane Seymour.
Jane, of course.
Utter rubbish, utter rubbish. I think the love of his life was Anne Boleyn. I sincerely do, and people go, well, you know, if she was the love of his life, why would it have ended the way it did? But in some respects, I think that it adds credence to the theory that she was the love of his life because where I'm getting at with this is I often describe them as Henry and Anne as the Tudor Burton and Taylor that can't live without mentality where it's so built on passion and so built on pressure that it's only ever going to explode in the end. But I think when I look at Anne and Henry's story, that is how I see it, and I think I'm right.
Well, it's certainly the way I see it. And it
Yeah.
seems to me, and if I had to say, you know, to describe the love of his life, I mean, I think my tendency would be to talk about each woman and how they were the woman for that period in his life. However,
Yes.
however, I think that after Anne, there is a kind of cynicism that creeps into him that brings out the worst in him.
Hmm.
That and that to me has a to do with having been someone that he was passionately drawn to, perhaps for reasons he didn't completely understand too, which would have
Mm.
been, you know, grated on Henry's soul. And if he believed any of the stuff that was fed him at the end, he would also have felt just horribly betrayed. I mean, I don't know whether he believed it or not, but
Mm.
he certainly felt, for whatever reason, that his manhood was under attack, which is, of course,
Yeah.
one of the things that Anne of the Thousand Days gets right in its non-historical way. Um, and I think that it just changes. It changes the possibilities. For here's an idea. I'll just throw it out. It just came to me. To the extent that Henry was raised on tales of Guinevere and Lancelot and Arthur, and he was, right? There
Yeah.
was that romanticism in him.
Yeah. The courtly love side.
Exactly. And it warred against other parts of his nature. But it may, I'm speculating here that when he killed Anne, that part was decisively murdered too. That
Mm.
from then on, there was nothing genuine about his courtships. They were all instrumental. They were all aimed at, for political reasons or, religious political religious reasons, or the having of a son and all that stuff. And with Anne there was something else going on there.
I think you can even see that in this. There's always been this question over why the sword? Why was the sword adopted to dispatch Anne? And there's a slight inherent chivalric thing going on there with, the sword in the stone and all, Lancelot and Guinevere and all that kind of thing. But I've often also wondered, was this also some proof of Henry actually knowing this woman is probably innocent? Because it is not a kindness that he gives to Catherine Howard a few years later, when her guilt is much more assured than it was with Anne. And I have wondered sometimes if that was because we know that the sword was considered a cleaner, more assured method of death that Catherine Howard did not receive. So that's some, and that has, I think there's, I agree with you. I think after the death of Anne Boleyn, that chivalric side of him was certainly diminished. I mean, we see a bit with when he went to try and surprise Anne of Cleves in costume and things like
But that
that.
was performance
And
rather than heart.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Well, I think she was, when I say she was the love of his life, I think she was the woman who he found the most remarkable.
Yeah.
I think Catherine was, of Aragon, that is, was his first love, his teenage love. He was 17 when they married. She was 5 years his senior. I think that was that sort of youthful crush that just, but equally, had they had sons, I think there is zero doubt they would have stayed
Yeah.
together. They would have done. But Anne is different, I think, and I just the labeling it as Jane simply because she gave him the son, I think, is just far too simplifying of things.
I agree. I agree completely.
Yeah.
It's that yeah, why have we clung to that one so much?
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy, really. Maybe it's just a holdover, a little piece of debris from the old versions of Anne that we just
Mm.
we she's just not the good woman. Jane is the good woman who, of course, gives him a
Yeah.
son. God speaks through her and gives her a son. I think with Catherine, I don't even think it was a crush. I think that it was like an arranged marriage, and that he did love her. I mean, he'd love her in the way that a 17-year-old might get to love someone who initiates him into the world of relationships. But I'm not sure that there was ever, any kind of emotional stuff. The letters are you can never tell from those letters. There's a chapter in my book, as you know, which is all about how we read those letters, because there was so much that was conventional and performative about them. This is what you said when you were courting a woman. And, you lied too. Lying was perfectly okay. If it would be appealing. So we did write love letters to Catherine, but I don't take them as that much proof of anything.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and having this chat. It's been really fun. So, people, if you've not read The Creation of Anne Boleyn, please do go and find it in bookstores, on Amazon and so on. Susan, you mentioned at the start you've got your Substack, so do you want to maybe just take a quick moment to let people know where they can find that?
Yeah, it's very easy to find. It's at Susan Bordo, all small letters, Susan Bordo, Bordo, substack.com. And there is a whole section that, there's a kind of, a top thing which lists different categories, although I don't really use it very much anymore. But one of them is Anne Boleyn special. And if you're particularly interested in Anne Boleyn, all the articles having to do with Anne Boleyn, the interview with Geneviève Bujold, the interview with Natalie Dormer, they're all there. So I don't want that to dissuade you from getting the book. They are just little nuggets from the book. Yeah. But if you want to be introduced to the way I write in that book before you invest in the book, you could look at that. And you don't have to invest in the Substack either. Either you can subscribe for free, and then there are those who want to, get an appreciation fee of a very, very inexpensive yearly subscription. But I would rather those of you who are interested in Anne Boleyn just subscribe and for free and go in and, have a look at the Anne Boleyn stuff. I write about a lot of other things. It's very reflective of my different interests. And people are free to, I write every week, and people are free to read what they want to and then not read it. There are also, if you become interested in what I have to say about other novels, there's a piece on Lolita in there that I like. That my Anne Boleyn book looks at the written word, the book, and then the movie versions, and talks about the movie versions and how they have reinterpreted Lolita and Humbert. There's a lot about television and TV series there, and there's also a lot about American politics, which you're free to not read should you not want to get too depressed and angry on that particular day.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Susan, again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Adam. Have a good day.
That brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. My thanks to Susan Bordo for joining me. As we're now into October, and as such Black History Month, in next week's episode I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Miranda Kaufman all about her book, Black Tudors, The Untold Story. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out to me via Instagram at The Tudor Chest. Thank you very much for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak to you next week.